Among the many blocks to the creative flow in our lives, whether or not we're dealing with the creative flow of money or the creative flow of projects we want to get involved with, or even the creative flow of relationships or health, you have to deal with the major block. In fact, it may be the major block of all, which is addictions. For the most part, when people think of addictions, they think of substance abuse, food, gambling, alcohol. In my experience, however, I stretch that definition to a much broader perspective, and I think it should be understood this way. And as I discuss addiction with you, what I would like you to do is first become very open-minded and recognize that it is impossible to identify all your addictions. You don't realize how many addictions you have that in fact hold the whole of your life together. So much so that I would say that for the average person, he or she holds together the very fiber of life through a complex of addictive patterns. Having said that, let me introduce the various categories of addictions that play a tremendous role in blocking the process of you creating the type of life you would like to experience for yourself. In addition to the substances that are commonly known, there's addictions to abuse. We may not always think that there's such a thing as being addicted to abuse, but there is. Because in abusive dynamics, that becomes a language you understand. You understand a language of abuse, in which case, at some point, it isn't abusive. It's simply the language you speak. And let me move this one step further. And that's that even in this extreme example that I'm giving you, which is an addiction to an abuse, what occurs within the creative process is that attitudes, talents, the way we think, you want to consider as containers of your energy. They are containers. And addiction is a container of energy. And when you get involved in even an abusive container, it still is a way that helps you control energy as it's flowing through you and manage your own behavior. It still is a way of helping you control your emotions. One of the reasons we find addiction so useful is because they are external controlling forces that take the responsibility for the management of ourselves literally out of our hands and into something else. And even abuse serves that role. But continuing, addictions include attitudes. Self-pity is an addiction. Another form of addiction is exercise, being right, needing to control other people, judging others. Judging others is a serious addiction. You may not think of self-pity as an addiction, but that energy of the martyr in people is extremely powerful. And it becomes a voice, just like abuse. It becomes a voice through which you communicate. Being critical is an addiction. It's a pattern that works to control another individual. Self-criticism is an addiction. Now, when I say addiction, let me define it in this regard. It is a behavior you participate in, either consciously or unconsciously, that controls the flow of creative life force through your system. And addiction allows you to be irresponsible for a percentage of the energy that runs through you, and therefore you aren't responsible for its consequences. We are born addicts. None of us is born whole. None of us is born completely empowered. We are born addicts. It's just a matter of time before you find out what you will be addicted to. Needing approval is a form of an addiction. And particularly needing a certain person's approval, you can be addicted to a person. A relationship that is beyond reason. An addiction has qualities to it in that it is beyond reason. You can say to somebody, why do you drink 3 bottles of alcohol a day? It is not reasonable. Look what it's doing to you. That has nothing to do with it. You can't reach an addict through reason. That's already well known. In my experience, the way I describe addiction is this. Of all the many challenges of the human experience, without a doubt, becoming congruent is the ultimate challenge. Because the journey of becoming congruent, becoming a whole being, where you mean what you say and you feel what you mean, where all of you lines up behind every choice you make, where all 7 chakras are completely aligned in every relationship, in every choice you make, in every perception you have. That's congruent. If you are not congruent, you will be an addict. It's either one or the other. Why? Because it goes like this. In the absence of congruency, you look like this. Your mind will be one being, or represent one part of you, and your heart will be another. None of us begins life with head and heart in the same place. We just don't. It's not an error. It's not a matter of abuse. Somehow it seems to be the natural consequence of certain upbringings. Some families have very strong mental upbringings. Others are very emotional. None of us is brought up perfectly balanced. That's simply not the way of life. From an enormously archetypal point of view, as if I took you off the planet and put planet Earth beneath you and said, let's just talk about it from a mechanical point of view. Let's get out of right, wrong, good, bad. Let's just talk mechanics. We incarnate and we need to be splintered. Our spirit needs to be splintered, not unlike the metaphor of the 12 tribes of Israel. And it needs to take off in 12 different directions to experience 12 different avenues of life. In that splintering, polarities are created in our lives. Extreme polarities. Our mind and our heart are polarities to each other. Part of the road of becoming conscious is to unite the head and the heart, is to make it one instrument. And in making it one instrument, the 5th chakra, or the mechanism of choice, becomes a united force. When the mind and the heart are not united, who's minding the will? The will is an energy. Choice is an energy. It's like your heartbeat. You make choices. Every thought is a choice. Every word in your head is a choice. Every attitude is a choice. It's also a prayer. You don't realize how many choices you make all the time. Consciousness is about becoming conscious of what you're doing with choice. Choice is the act of directing your spirit into matter. We are now rolling one step backwards from creation, and you're taking a look at what you do in terms of choice. You don't realize how many choices you are making in every moment that X each other out, that are completely contradictory. Where one part of you has no idea that another part of you is choosing something that X's that out. What do you mean by that? Like this. Your mind says, I completely agree with you, and your heart says, you do not. You're in a relationship and the person you're sitting opposite says, tell me, is there something wrong? And your mind says, no, this couldn't be better. Your heart says, will you get out of this relationship? You've never been happy in this relationship. Your mind says, this person is wonderful. He or she is there for me. He supports me. She supports me. And you start going through the mental qualifiers. And your mind is fine. And your heart says, I'm telling you, I don't feel good with this person. You've got your head and your heart. And they're making two different decisions at all times. That other person says, what do you say we go away for the weekend and kind of reconnect? And your mind says, yeah, okay, that sounds, I can give this another chance. And your heart says, I'm not going. I'm staying home. Go ahead, go. Pack, get out of here, but I'm staying home. That person might say to you, what's wrong? I just don't feel like you're all involved in this. I don't feel like you're here. And your heart says to your mind, go and tell him. Tell him, I'm not going. Or tell her, I'm staying home. You don't realize you are, in that instant, two different people. And you are creating 2, 3, 4 simultaneous realities at once. And you don't even know it. And a person sits opposite you and says, I can't figure you out. How could they possibly figure you? You can't figure yourself out. Your will, your choice power, the authority you have to maneuver energy into matter is so profound. It is the force with which you interact with the laws of creation. It is the force that directs your spirit into cause and effect, into magnetic attraction. It's that force. When you direct your energy, it is through your will that this profound ritual of creation is conducted. In the uniting of your head and your heart, you become an extraordinarily powerful, forceful vessel of energy. You become a whole vessel. Thought comes into form almost instantaneously, if not instantaneously, when you are congruent. What do I mean by that? I mean this. When you have energy coming into your 7th chakra, and then it moves into your 6th with inspiration, and then it moves into your 5th, and it says, can you make choices? Are you ready to communicate this idea? And right to the heart. And the heart and the head meet for a second and say, I'm in this. And your heart says, I'm in this. And boom, right into matter. Because, why? You are a being without conflict. And that's the cue. You are someone without internal conflict. Now, if you look at how many of our mythic stories, how many of our fairy tales are in fact, when you look deeply at them or through them symbolically, what you're dealing with is a story that represents the division of the head and the heart and how they look in our society. Specifically, let's take it the princess and the knight. Knights wear shields in front of them because they say, don't come near my heart. My heart's not my job. I married that princess. She's my heart. But don't go near her mind, so I'll put her in a castle because she doesn't have the brains to think in the world. I'll wear this shield because I don't have the courage to feel in the world. The knight and the princess. This is a myth. This is an archetype that has formed us. We completely live in a culture, in a world, in which we think that emotions have no intelligence and intelligence has no emotions. We think that mind is power and heart is weak. We think that women have no intelligence and men have no feelings. Now, this is an archetypal dynamic that is very much a part of our world still. Whether or not we care to admit it, it runs the society. Because the will is an instrument that is so powerful, and because choice is so powerful, without a unified or congruent energy, your will find something to give it stability. An addiction is a form of stability. It is a regular dynamic, a regular infusion, a regular pattern that determines its behavior. It's like a surrogate parent. So long as the husband and wife, the mind and the heart, have a bad marriage and they don't communicate, this child called will has to find a substitute parent or structure that gives it consistency, and that's an addiction. And so your will sneak out at night, it'll go out the back door, and it will find something that appeals to it, that takes over its psyche, because you cannot yet consciously unite or become congruent. So your will go wandering, and it might go and decide food should be its companion, or it might find some substance. It can find exercise. You can become a spendaholic, a workaholic, any kind of holic. All of these holics and all of these other substances are truly a means that keep the willpower making choices on a regular basis that hold together the same reality. Let me say this again, because it's worth understanding in as deeply a way as you can. What an addiction does is that it serves the purpose of making the same choice over and over and over again. And in making this choice over and over again, it is an effort to slow down your process of growth so that your life does not change. One of the reasons why it is so difficult to break an addiction, any addiction, whether it's an attitude addiction or a substance addiction, is because from an energetic point of view, you're withdrawing your spirit from a pattern of continuation, and you're allowing your head and your heart to make contact with each other for the first time, perhaps ever. You are creating a merger of forces that occurs in your fifth chakra, because in order to break an addiction, as is well known, you cannot help someone break an addiction by just entering one chakra without the other. If you go in just to their minds and you try to be rational, that won't help. If you just enter into the heart and you approach them emotionally, even you talking to yourself, you can't break an addiction emotionally. Your heart doesn't have the strength, because it's too filled with reasons, emotional reasons, why it's okay to be addicted. I'm lonely, I was hurt, I have no other companions. You'll find some emotional reason that gives you permission to maintain the addiction. And your mind will provide you with any kind of rationale you want. The mind is better at this. I'm not an addict. I've never been an addict. I can stop whenever I want. The heart provides excuses and the mind provides denial. And that's how they work. In between is the will, and I want you to imagine it, looking up at the sixth, looking down at the fourth, saying, who do I listen to today? Are you angry or are you hurt? Are you in denial or are you in emotion? What's going on here? So there's no one minding your choices. And as a consequence, as a person, not only do you have to be an addict, you will make one inconsistent choice after another in your life. You won't be able to create consistently. And one day your heart will be calling the shots within you. Another day your mind will be producing all kinds of interesting little voices. Someone will say, well, how do you feel? Are you sure your heart's in this? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. You will not know yourself until you're congruent. None of us does. So long as you're an addict, you have the right to blame something or someone else for why things happen as they do in your life. If you weren't an addict, you can't do that. It takes an enormous amount of responsibility to become a congruent person. While it sounds terrific on paper and in theory, without a doubt, it is completely intimidating. And that is because congruency implies that you have no place to hide. It's very difficult to deny motivation, private agendas, who you are, what you really feel, what you really think, if you are operating on a spiritual inner life of being a congruent person. What happens is conscious denial becomes not an option for you. When you open that doorway from your head to your heart, and you say, okay, you two, we're now a team. I want to only make choices that serve both my head and my heart. You introduce the chemistry of transformation into your life. That's the chemistry. Now, for most people, the process of transformation begins when they come into their heart for the first time unescorted by a group of people. What I mean by that is prior to the emergence of yourself as an individual, your heart as well as your mind are managed by a group of people called the family, the tribe, the corporation. You're not your own being. You don't have your own heart, and you don't have your own mind, and therefore it's okay to let groups make the choices for you. It seems natural. Just like it's okay for you to make choices for somebody else. It's what groups do for each other. But then one day you decide, I've got to, quote, follow my own heart. I've got to find my own heart. I've got to find who I am. What you're really saying is, I've got to pull my chakras, my psyche, my heart, out of this huge group and begin to take charge of the creation of my life to make choices that suit my psyche and my heart. What you have to understand is at that point, when you're in the stage of revolution, when you decide, I've got to rebel, I got to get out of here, you still don't know who you are. All you know is who you don't want to be. And the next stage is finding out, okay, now that I'm out of the group and you're stark naked and you're looking at yourself in your own psyche and heart and mind and choice for the first time in your life, you are not a congruent being. In fact, you're all over the place. And the first place you go discovering who you are, your porthole into yourself is your heart. So you jump into your heart, your personal heart, for the first time. And this is where you start finding out what your feelings really are. You never realized you felt this way, and you never realized you felt that way. This discovery of the inner self-heart is a phenomenal journey for people. This is where people discover that they had talents they didn't know about. You find that you, in fact, have a whole nother level of potential, talent, inspiration that could not be tapped into while you were a resident of a collective mind and a collective heart and a collective will. It simply was unable to grow in that greenhouse. It's not right or wrong, it's a matter of the laws of creation. When you break away from living within a culture where your choices, your mind and your heart are naturally flowing within a group, oftentimes you don't realize you're an addict. And it's very easy not to realize you're an addict. In fact, group energies hide addiction. Well, I don't really drink. We just have wine before dinner. And I don't really overeat, or I don't really work all the time. Groups provide excuses for addictions because of social behavioral patterns. It's very easy to be an addict when you're part of a group. For the most part, you don't even begin to come to terms with how deeply an addict you are till you leave a group psyche, where you finally pull away from people that you took drugs with all the time, and you step outside of that room where you are taking drugs and you realize, I used to be a part of that room, that you couldn't see your own self so long as you're in that room. The natural process of moving into the empowered self is going to take you right here. And that's, you have to learn to develop the spiritual will. This is a challenge that faces each one of us. Sometimes in the journey of becoming conscious, in the journey of asking God, for what purpose was I born? Or how can I serve you? In asking that question, the answer often begins to unfold by you receiving a challenge, some obstacle in life that compels you to build that bridge between the mind and the heart. Because if you are to be given a spiritual instruction, or even if part of your greatest spiritual potential is to be allowed to emerge or wake up inside of you, you have to be able to handle that power. And that's going to require a stronger unity between your mind and your heart. In my studies of mysticism, both academically and in these years that I've met people who very much are involved deeply within a process of mystical unfoldment within themselves, every one of them shares in some part a journey of recognizing the deep need to become congruent, and that if that need is blocked, if they do not proceed without argument on that path of becoming congruent, the consequences of that will be the depth of despair, not as punishment. The gods don't punish, but rather as a result of having invoked a phenomenal process of awakening to the self, then choosing to block it. There is a consequence that comes into your mind and into your heart when you've begun the journey of becoming a whole person, and then you abort it, you sabotage it halfway through. What I've noticed in so many people is, as they move forward in their lives, one of the first challenges that people generally encounter, and this is universal, is that what comes to call are all of the wounds in your life you need to forgive. That tends to be among the first bridges that you have to build between the 6th and the 4th chakras. You know, when you have a lot to forgive, another way for me to say that is, you have a lot of your spirit left in your history. If you have a lot of spirit in your history, you have to be an addict. And you will be an addict. History equals addiction. The reason this is so is because even deeper than your temporal memory, even deeper than your memory of this lifetime, is the knowledge of the lifetime before you incarnated and the rules of the spiritual community of God. Your spirit's born knowing the natural laws of creation. That's why, as you listen to this series, you should be able to relate and say, you know, I always knew that, or I always knew this. That's absolutely right. My attitude does play this role. That's right. I have allowed addiction to eclipse personal responsibility. That's absolutely right. Because if I have an addiction, I get to say, this isn't my doing, and then I am able to claim weakness, and then I'm able to say, I can't move forward with my life because I'm not strong enough, and I'm able to postpone my maturity. I can control the flow and movement of my whole evolution if I have an addiction. And most of all, I don't have to take responsibility for the consequences of who I am as an individual. if I have a good enough addiction. And so when you hold on to your past, let's say through an inability to forgive, what you have there is the types of addictions that come into play with that particular crisis tend to be addictions that alter your state of consciousness. Not all addictions do. Workaholism doesn't. The inability to forgive tends to lead to addictions in alcohol, drugs, and food. There's a natural reason for this, and that's that wounds call for company. Company calls for food. It's a natural cycle of people to substance to social. Now, if you have wounds in the neighborhood of, say, abuse as a child and incest or wounds of that variety, remember that those still lead to issues to forgive, so that will still lead you down a path of food and drugs, alcohol, in the oral substance or the injection substance of addiction. Okay, so we have that department. Now, in another area, what motivates the addictions to workaholism and to exercise, those are addictions of the ego. The food, alcohol, those are addictions of the broken heart. Now let's go to the addictions of power and ego. And they tend to be the addictions to money, workaholism, authority, clout, addictions of the high social order. You could think, how could someone be addicted to certain social groups? Don't be ridiculous. You can form an addiction to the power of another person's reputation because of what it does to your reputation. If suddenly you were not welcomed in that person's energy field, you wouldn't just be hurt as you would if a friend said, our relationship's over. You would go through a power withdrawal. And that's your indication that in fact there was an element of addiction. Power addiction. And if I took that one step further, because it's worth taking one step further, when we're in a relationship where there is an addiction to the power of that other person, recognize that that other person would have more authority over the choices you make than you do. And that's the determining feature. Is this an addiction? Bottom line is, can that substance, person, place, thing, exercise, habit, hobby exert more force over you than you do? And if the answer is yes, or if the answer is even, well, it's a struggle, sometimes I win, sometimes I don't, then you're looking an addiction right in the face. So how do you break an addiction? Let me give you some stories of people who have worked with their archetypes and succeeded at breaking addictive patterns within themselves, beginning with identifying the role that particular archetype played in their behavior.